Well, President Trump is blaming the fact that he's never hit at least 50% in Gallup approval polls on the Mueller probe during an extensive interview with Time magazine as he prepared to kick off his 2020 re-election rally yesterday. Trump said, quote, "Based on the economy, I should be up 15 or 20 points higher," arguing that he has a natural base of 45 or 46%. He added, quote, "The thing that I have that nobody's ever had before from the day I came down the escalator, I have had a phony witch hunt against me. I think it's cost me." We'll just note that special counsel Robert Mueller did not begin his investigation until 4 months into Trump's newly minted administration, when his overall approval rating was already sitting at just 38%. He's the only president in the history of Gallup polling, never to earn a majority approval rating for a single day in office. Trump did note to Time that the Mueller probe has ignited his Republican base, saying, quote, "It's made our people more resilient," and that he hopes to fuel his 2020 campaign with that momentum. And I should point out other historic things pertaining to this administration. No Secretary of Defense, I guess a new one now that's acting. I mean, this is crazy how many cabinet posts are filled by acting cabinet secretaries, and it's a blank slate in there, just a bunch of people that suck up to the president in a frightening way.
Yeah, you know, Donald Trump is right when in his analysis of Republicans. They have actually become stronger Trump supporters because of the Mueller probe. But again, he's been playing what I've been saying is a 33% game, John Heilman. It's actually more of a 38, 39% game, which is just continuing to talk about illegal immigration, continuing to exaggerate, continuing to demonize immigrants, continuing to demonize Americans who are, quote, the others, continuing to talk about building walls, continuing to attack allies across the globe. And that's, again, it's what remains the great mystery of the Trump presidency for me. Why has he never figured out, why has no one around him ever figured out that he needs to expand his base? He needs to do things, and this illegal immigrant witch hunt that he's doing just doesn't work, because college-educated people know that before he became president, illegal crossings in the southern border were at a 50-year low. So that doesn't work for educated voters. So I just remain flummoxed that even at this late day, this guy's not trying to get to 50%. He's going back to the well and just digging down deeper into his own base.
He's, you know, if you think about the totality of the Trump presidency so far, this has been a signal feature of it, right? Which is, like, unlike any presidents in the past, we've seen others that have been elected with having lost the popular vote. We've seen others that have been elected well south of 50% of the vote. Normally what you do in that circumstance is you come in and say, I need more votes if I'm going to get reelected.
What did George W. Bush do? He went to Ted Kennedy. No child left behind.
Right.
First thing he did was education reform.
And Bill Clinton as a 43% president. You go in and you say, I'm not going to get reelected if I don't gain some new vote between now and the reelection. Trump has not done that. He's gone back over and over again. I think part of it has to do with the fact that, unlike the rest of us, he doesn't realize that he pulled it inside straight. He thinks he won a landslide in 2016. He talks about it over and over again. I think he believes that. And so he thinks, if I just do again what I did in 2016, I'll win again, because he doesn't think it was that close. He doesn't get it for whatever reason. And I just take him at his word. He said over and over again, greatest landslide in history, you know.
Right.
So I believe he thinks that. The problem for him is that, and I think Ron will back me up on this, you know, having covered a lot of these, you're an incumbent president. You know, the question is this going to be a referendum or a choice? For a guy like Donald Trump, who's never been above 44 or above 46, but has been around in the mid to low 40s the whole time, he can't let it be a referendum. We saw what happened when it was a referendum in the midterms. It was a referendum on Trump, and he wasn't even on the ballot, and his party got crushed. So he can't let it be a referendum. So all he's going to be doing is trying to demonize the Democratic Party. And to Ron's point, if the Democrats can put someone up who can slough off those attacks and keep the focus on Donald Trump, all the things that crushed the Republican Party in 2018 are going to crush the Republican Party again in 2020, because now Trump, all the personality things that moderate voters did not like then, they like them even worse with Donald Trump on the ballot.
Right. So Heidi, that's the problem for the Republican Party, that has become even more in the House and Senate, become even more Trump-like over the past few years, that Donald Trump continuing to just narrow down to this base and boil down and boil down and boil down to this base requires that senators that have to win statewide in states like Colorado and North Carolina follow along with him, requires that House members and House candidates do the same to get through primaries, and in so doing, he's damning the Republican Party to another route in 2020.
And he's also making a very serious miscalculation in terms of his approach to repeating 2016, because he cannot do the same thing in 2016, where we all called this a populist surge. Because in 2016, he had some actual populist promises that he made, Joe, like the forgotten man, like getting us out of foreign wars. These are things that have not materialized at all. As a matter of fact, not only have they not materialized, it's been the exact opposite. If you look at the economic prescriptions, have been from the traditional establishment Republican donor textbook, tax cuts. And so he can't repeat those same promises. So it's basically, when you talk about boiling it down, you're boiling it down simply to the grievance aspect of his pitch. And if you listen to him last night, he's now trying to superimpose his own grievances about the Mueller report onto his people, saying, this isn't just about me, this is them coming after you. Right. And when you remove the policies from it, because to be fair, there were some policies there, you're left simply with the anger and the grievance politics without any of the policies about the forgotten people.
Right. And Ron, we talk about boiling things down. What Donald hasn't figured out yet is that when you're in office for 4 years, your 4 years is boiled down to 30 seconds. Yep. And in those 30 seconds, just those 30 seconds, you tell me, how are the voters in Macomb County going to respond to Donald Trump, or somebody voicing Donald Trump the night that his tax cut passed, right? Saying to all of his billionaire friends sitting around at Mar-a-Lago, I just made all of you a lot richer today. How's Donald Trump's former supporters in Macomb County going to respond to the fact that he's supporting a fleet of Republican lawyers going around from court to court, state to state, district to district, trying to kill the pre-existing protections for people in Macomb County and across the state of Michigan? How are they going to deal with the fact that time and time again, Donald Trump has passed corporate welfare while cutting other parts of the safety net? It's just, I don't get it. I don't know how he survives that.
I can tell you how they're responding right now. That percentage of his supporters who have been swing voters, who voted for Obama and then voted for him, who voted for Clinton and then voted for Obama and him, they're taking a second look at him now. They already have doubts about him now. They're looking for another course. They're looking for another potential validator of their grievances. That's why this re-election is going to be much harder for him than his election. It all comes down to John's point. If this is a referendum on Donald Trump, like almost every re-election of an incumbent has been, he's going to lose. But I wouldn't underestimate, what I'm going to watch is I would not underestimate his ability to be able to make this a choice election, which would defy all past presidential elections. But he's really good about making everything about me versus them, us versus them. And if he can make this a choice election, and the Democrats put up a choice that is not attractive in Macomb County, he might have a shot.
Still ahead on Morning Joe, we're going to get to the major developments involving Iran, plus new details on that major shakeup at the Pentagon. A lot going on here. Watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.